Okay, good morning, everybody. We're back for another coffee with the artists. Thanks for a little couple weeks sabbatical here. This morning, we're going to talk with Lisa Binkley, and Lisa's in Wisconsin. So I think we'll get started by just letting Lisa tell us a little bit about herself and about her creative journey, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Suzanne. And thanks for having me here. I have been watching this series and I just feel like I'm learning so much and I love the format. And so I was really happy when you invited me to be here. So I was one of those kids who was playing with beads and yarn and paint and drawing. And ever since I was probably a preschooler, so I think there was never really a life that I didn't feel like I was wanting to create things. And fortunately, my parents were really supportive of that. So they would sign me up for different kinds of art workshops in the summers. And then when I got to college, I hopped around a lot of different majors, but finally settled on textile design and really fell in love with that. And I was weaving quite a bit back then. Met my husband. He was doing an MFA in drawing and printmaking. And he's been really encouraging and supportive of me continuing to pursue my artwork. Got out of college and I needed a job and didn't find one, doing textiles. Got married and we were living in Milwaukee. And so I ended up teaching art classes at a nursing home and I did custom sewing for people. And then went and got a master's in urban planning. And I spent about 10 years doing public policy work and historic preservation planning. And I really enjoyed it. But then we had our kids and I felt like I wasn't doing a very good job of any one thing. I think that's how, most moms of young kids felt very scattered. And we realized we were spending pretty much all of my take-home pay on childcare. And said, okay, if there's ever a time to dive into trying to get back into art, now's the time. And so I ended up leaving my job at the state of Wisconsin. And that was back in '99. So it's been quite a few years. My kids are now both basically in grad school. But when I left that work, I knew I wanted to get back into fiber art. And at the time I thought, I'm going to weave, I'm going to get this great big loom and do a lot of rug weaving. And then I got together with a friend who does ceramics. And she happened to have Paula Nadelstern's book of kaleidoscopes and quilts from way back. And so this would have been, like late '90s. And I saw that book and I thought, oh my gosh, I had no idea you could do that kind of stuff with fabric. And I realized I really wanted to make quilts. And then I got Jane Sassaman's book on the quilted garden. And I think those two books just got me inspired to get fabric, start cutting things up and putting them back together. And I had saved a bunch of sketches I had done from back when I was weaving in college that I always loved as designs, even if they wouldn't necessarily work structurally as a weaving. So my very first couple of quilts I did were based on sketches I had done as a weaver, and then fell in love with border prints. And so I started doing a lot of really ornate, kind of almost like Oriental rug type designs with border prints and lots of printed fabric. And I think one of the things that's been so fun over the now 21 or so, 22 years I've been at this, working in fiber art, is the way my work continued to evolve throughout that time. But I finally feel like the last, say, 5-10 years, I have found what the core of my passion is, which is botanical printing and dyeing and hand stitching with beads and with embroidery threads. And so for the last several years, I've really been working to combine the hand stitching with the botanicals and just love that. And so it's interesting, even if, as I was getting ready for this talk and looking back through this body of work, it's like, this is, what I've got behind me now is some of it's a bit older, some of it's a bit newer, but I think it's the best example of what I'm doing now. But very big change from what I started out at when I was using all commercial prints and things like that. But I remember hearing a talk by a pretty accomplished fiber artist, and she was talking about finding your voice as an artist. And I remember at the time thinking, I don't know what that is. I kind of get the gist of what it means, but I don't know that I know what that is. And then, as I started discovering details of techniques and colors and imagery that I really loved, I just found that most everything I did had leaves in it. And it wasn't the only thing I liked, but I just always had ideas of what I wanted to do with leaves, whether it was printing or just using the shapes of leaves. I've got a lot of water imagery in my work because I'm really drawn to big bodies of water. So I grew up in the Chicago area and went down to the beach quite a bit. And so at some point I kind of looked at my body of work and I thought, okay, I think I've actually found my voice artistically. And it was fun to have that happen without feeling like I had set out to do it. It just kind of came through the process of making over the years.
So do you do a lot of gardening at home too? Are you a
I
gardener?
do. I do. Yeah, absolutely. And, we have lived in several different houses in the Madison area over the years, but the house we're in now, so we've got a pretty big yard, even though we're right in town. And I love gardening, and particularly because we have such long winters. And so I, plant all kinds of things. I think the last 5 or 6 years, I keep planting things that print well. So smoke bush and coral bells and peonies, and then we've got lots of oak trees and maple trees in our neighborhood, and lots of catalpa trees in the neighborhood. And in fact, I just ordered a catalpa tree to plant in the yard because I really want those great big leaves. And yeah, so gardening is probably my other biggest creative pursuit outside of the fiber work. So, I try to get as much stitching done as I can during the colder season, because I know once gardening season happens, I'm going to want to spend at least several hours in the yard. And, and
So how do you think COVID has affected your creativity?
well, and that's a really good question. I mean, certainly it slowed my life down a lot because I had what felt like a really fabulous 2020 schedule. Like a lot of people, oh, I'm so excited. I got all these great classes I'm going to teach. And then one by one, the emails roll in, well, we're probably not going to run this. And so I think initially it was just kind of this stunned of like, what does this mean? And we were really fortunate in that we were able to continue doing a lot of stuff online. And but I had, you can see a lot of the pieces behind me are fairly small. And when I first started quilting, the very first quilt I made was about 6 by 8 feet. So it was big. And I had been wanting to go big again for a long time. But I felt like, oh, I'm just so busy. I don't really have the time. Well, I now have the tops of 3 quilts that are each at least 100 inches in one direction. So they are ready for sitting on we've got a lovely screen porch on the back of our house. And my plan when I'm not gardening is to mostly be sitting out there hand quilting all summer in between teaching. So I think that the shutdown really helped give me chunks of time to work on individual pieces that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And there were definitely times where you get really sad. I mean, my stepmother and father both had COVID. They fortunately both came through it okay. But you just kind of are listening to and watching what's going on in the world, and it can be pretty troubling. And I find that when I get sort of overwhelmed, it's the same thing I do that when I get stuck, where I just pick up something really simple like mending or just very simple sort of running stitch that I'm doing on. It's a way to kind of calm me down and center me. But I feel like I got comfortable with just being home so much, then I was excited to have chunks of time to be working on some really physically large pieces.
So are you ready to get back out there now?
It's been, I mean, I think I'd mentioned earlier that I only did 3 in-person classes in the last year, and which is a lot less than I normally do. And I loved it. And every time I just felt like, oh, this is what I love being with students. And so I'm very ready for that. But I'm also, I don't know, a little kind of like, this is really nice to be home. And it's the first spring I've been home pretty much through the whole spring. So like there was one year I completely missed my red bud, blooming. And so I'm excited that I'll be here and I'll get to see that happening. I think it was good for me to get sort of forced to learn how to teach online because it's something I had thought about pursue, and then once things shut down, there was a guild I was scheduled to teach for last June, and I've taught for them quite a few times. And they said, "Hey, we're thinking we're going to try. Would you be willing to give it a try?" And I thought, if there's ever a forgiving audience, this is it, because I know these people well. And so we went online, and it was okay. It worked really pretty well, and it gave me the nudge that I needed to start getting comfortable. So I've now been online pretty much continuously since last June for a bunch of different places. And I really like it. And I think one of the things I found that I like is that I can have students from all over the country, and they'll say, "I couldn't necessarily have taken this class if we were trying to do it in person." So I love the in person. I'm also seeing a lot of the benefits of the online. And so I think I'll continue to do a mix of both even after things open up. But I think mostly, I'd say probably, you know, 60 to 70% of the teaching will be in person, because that's still my favorite format. And
Well, I've had this discussion with a couple of instructors. I mean, I actually have one who people are calling me and they're going, "Why should I come and take this class in your studio when I can take it online with her still? And it's a lot less money and I don't have to travel." Needless to say, we did have 3 people signed up for the class, and now all 3 are doing it with her online. So her class isn't going to run.
yeah,
And she said, "I'd much rather be coming to Florida and doing the class down there."
yeah,
Um, I think at some point, I know myself, I'm kind of stepping back. I mean, I divorced myself too, but I'm kind of stepping back from the online a little because
mhm.
I'm trying to get people enthused to come back.
Well, and
And
yeah, and I've been trying to look at which of the classes I teach feel like online is a really good format, and which ones it's just not. And I think I'm not set up to do the really beautiful videos of like botanical printing and dyeing, and ever envision teaching that online. And frankly, I don't want to, because I feel like there's so much excitement in everybody getting to see what everybody else is pulling out of the pots and opening up. And you and I were on the side of the road collecting plant material back in January, and there's just something about that whole experience that's really wonderful. And so, trying to find a balance of what do you teach online, what do you teach in person, and then not, well, I guess, not offering something online about the same time I'm going to offer it in person, because I'm just trying to be supportive of the places that I teach. Also, being available to people who don't necessarily have the budget to travel. So, I think that's one of the next challenges we're going to face, sort of as a group of professional fiber artists, is how do you balance the online with the in-person. But I feel like I'm like a little kid when I'm teaching botanical printing and dyeing, because anytime they're going to open, it's like, wait, I want to come over and watch. And I just genuinely get excited to see what's coming out, and there's just that magic of the different kinds of prints, and then I have no idea what made that happen, or I can guess, but it could be 10 different things, but it looks really great. And so that feeds my creativity too, because I'll just see things people have tried, and I end up leaving the class really fired up to get back into my studio and then keep going. And I find that
you
really cool.
you do a lot of beading in your work. What got you into the beading? How did you get inspired to do
Yeah,
beading?
so that's a good question. So when I first started doing quilts back in like very late 99, I was doing just machine quilted, pretty large scale quilts. And I met a couple of good friends through the Mad City Quilters Guild in Madison. And one of the women was doing beadwork and couching, really textured yarns and things. And, I was so new to quilting that I just hadn't seen a lot of what people were doing. And I saw that and I thought, oh, I love the texture and the mix of materials. And I remembered I loved beads when I was a little kid. There's just, it's hard to not love these beautiful little colored, shiny objects. And so after I saw my friend Susan's work, I started experimenting with adding beads to the surface of my quilts, and I just fell in love with it. I think to me, it's the mix of the texture of, the glass or clay or wood, the surface of it, and the contrast to fabric. I usually add the beads to the whole quilt. So it'll have, the top fabric and batting and backing. So the beads actually kind of quilt the surface and they create this wonderful texture. And then my work got smaller and smaller and smaller as I started doing a lot of handwork on it, just because it, it's so time consuming and it's just much easier to manipulate a much smaller object. And so now I'm wanting to take some of these, 70 by 100-inch quilts, and I still want to do some beadwork on there, but figuring out how to sort of blend those two passions. But so yeah, I've been working with beads probably for about 20 years. And when I first started teaching, I was teaching all bead and classes, and I spent about 10 years designing ornaments that people could make, that they could, create these little individual pieces and give them as gifts and things like that. And then after 10 years of designing the ornaments, I gave myself the permission to stop designing those because they were really taking up a huge chunk of my time. And then once I fell in love with botanical printing and dyeing, doing that by itself, but really hit a point where I thought I want to figure out how to marry these things, how to bring them together. So that's kind of where I am right now.
I mean, your hand stitching in your work, you have these beautiful little, tiny little intricate stitches. I mean, I can tell a piece of your work just by looking at it. And so I think about the amount of time, you have created in each piece between the hand stitching and the beading.
Yeah.
I mean, literally hours and hours and weeks and months.
Yep.
How do you go about pricing this kind of work?
Yeah.
It's like anything we do that's, so time consuming. How do you go about figuring out if it's priced, or do you just do it because you want to and you love it?
Yeah, well, and that's a great question. And I feel like that really ties into kind of decisions that I made about what I want to be doing professionally, because when you first get started in the field and like, okay, how do I try to make this a viable business? And I just love doing this intricate stitching with beadwork and with threads. And so when I sell pieces like the smaller pieces behind me, I look at them, and this is a non-scientific, what if I saw that and I saw a price on it, what would seem like an understandable price that I would feel fine getting half of, or if I'm selling it on my own, getting the whole price. And so frequently that's kind of how I price things. And so at one point years ago, I thought, well, I should really keep up with the hours I put in so that I know what I'm making for it. And I realized pretty quickly that it was really depressing, because it was, like 35 cents an hour or something like that. But what I also realized is that, there's so many different routes that I think you could take as a fiber artist. I mean, there's, the art fair circuit, and there's like one-of-a-kind shows and wearable shows and galleries and commissions. And what I realized was that since I love doing this really time-consuming, labor-intensive work, obviously the art fair circuit is not a good fit for me.
Right.
I can't produce enough, and I can't price it in a way that's going to make it appealing to people. But when I started teaching back in about 2007, and I realized pretty quickly how much I love teaching. And then I found that the really complex work I pack up and I take with me when I teach. And those pieces are so helpful for students, because we just kind of can hover over them and they'll say, what'd you do here and how'd you do that? And that the really labor intensive pieces end up becoming really good teaching tools for me. So I find that I can give myself permission to work on those, and though I really love working on those, and then I feel like I get a lot of value out of them. I mean, partly just process that I love, but I get a lot of value from them, using them as teaching tools. And then if down the road somebody says, I'd like to buy that, then I can price it in a way that maybe isn't going to give me a very good hourly rate, but that I still feel comfortable getting that price for the piece, because I know I'll make more pieces that I can use as teaching tools. So that's sort of a roundabout answer in terms of pricing. But for a lot of pieces, I try to do a little bit of an estimate of time, but then it's more kind of a what would I what would I see as a price in a gallery for this kind of piece that I would think would be reasonable. And a couple of pieces I have very, very high. And I think if somebody really wants it, then I'm comfortable selling it for that. But if it doesn't sell, I'm also really fine not selling it. But a lot of the smaller pieces I've been able to sell, which has been really nice. And just, people seeing work in like a presentation I give or at a class or something like that. And I've worked with some different galleries. And I'll usually have some little pieces going at the same time I'm doing the great big stuff. And I'm figuring, the great big stuff maybe is not going to sell as quickly for a whole bunch of different reasons. But one of my other goals is that I focused so much on teaching over the last, 15 or however many years it's been, 14 years, that I haven't been showing my work as much as I used to. Early on, I was every year submitting stuff to like the big quilt show in Houston and Paducah and a bunch of other shows. And I really haven't done nearly as much showing in the last 5 or 10 years. And that's one of my longer term goals, is to start getting stuff back out. So that's part of why I'm doing the bigger work too, because I really want to have some bigger, sort of showpieces that pull together the stuff I love, but they read well on a wall in a gallery. And so trying to do the mix of, even if it's like one big showpiece a year along with some of these smaller pieces, and then that feels like a really nice mix of activities for me.
Yeah, I've owned a few art galleries, and textiles is extremely difficult to show in a gallery setting.
Yeah.
Presentation is absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And I'm a member of a guild here, and they keep asking me, well, how come you don't ever have anything to put in any of the shows? And I realize that I don't have any work that I want to show. It's not showable, it's wearables, and it's and it's scarves, and it's things I make quick between classes. And so, putting these large pieces together to have a few, and then you kind of fall in love with a few, and you get to where you don't care if you sell them or not.
Right.
You spend so much time on it, you're in love with it. So when you get started on a piece, do you see the finished product, or does it just kind of evolve as you go along?
It definitely evolves. And I just gonna ask, I saw a couple of questions in the chat. Should we save those for the end, or what do you? Okay.
Yeah, I'll go on.
Okay, so I'll leave those then. But so I will have the vague idea of what I want to do. And so I'm just trying to think about an example of like what's hanging up behind me. That's right behind my left shoulder. That upper panel is a vintage men's handkerchief that I had used as a blanket for some eco printing with some eucalyptus. And then I kind of liked it. I kind of liked the little vertical rusty lines from the edge of the pipe, but it was a little bit bland. So I just did it in indigo, and about halfway down into the indigo, and liked what happened with it. And then the fabric that's underneath it was the breast-dyed fabric I had that was a little bit bland. And so I'll just kind of seeing materials together and thinking, oh, I could combine these different things. And then I'll think about a composition and what I want to put together. Sometimes it's a really vague process like that. Sometimes it's a clearer idea, like the piece that's up here, those little turtles are like little islands, and that's all beaded. And I love aerial photos. So I've seen aerial photos of islands and, tropical waters, and I love the different colors. And I had this beautiful mix of beads that are all kind of almost like beach glass. And I thought, oh, it would be really neat to stitch a piece that looks like an aerial photo of islands, but the turtles are the islands. And then I can show the different depths of the water by the colors of the bead. So again, it was just kind of a general idea. And then, laid out the turtle and just started doing the beading around that. But I find that I have a lot more fun letting pieces evolve as I'm working than I do if I have the whole thing out. Like probably the best example I have of the other extreme is a really large commission for someone's home quite a few years ago, 6 by 6 feet. And they really understandably wanted to have a pretty good feel of what it was going to look like before they committed to it, because it was a lot of money and it was right in their entry of their home. So I was scanning fabrics, putting them in Photoshop, laying out the whole piece. And, it was a quilt, there's no beadwork on there, and no hand stitching, but I had really designed it completely and then presented a printout to them. And when they said, yeah, that's great, we're going to go with this. And I spent the next 3 months just sort of executing, and making the quilt that I had designed. And while I loved, knowing that I had this great big piece I was selling, and that was nice, it was right after 9/11. And so it was actually a really nice time to have a big project that I could just sort of be absorbed in when the world felt very, very sad and scary. It wasn't as much fun because I didn't have permission to change things as I went. And I really love letting the sort of serendipity happen of, you've got a pile of fabrics you're working with and you suddenly see two things together that you never would have thought of, and decide that's really great and I want that to be the focal point of this piece. So I'll have, a general idea of like the scale that I want to work at. I usually have a title, a working title in my head when I start a piece, and I find that that helps me have a direction to go. And then sometimes I'll get to a point where I think that's not what this is anymore, and it changes directions. But that, I love poetry, I love literature, and so I think there's a connection to that as I have a title in my head. So this piece back here is called Entering the River, and down below you can see there's little fish beads and turtle beads that are underneath layers of sheer silk, and they're all swimming in this river. But it was actually a piece that I made, kind of commemorating several women who I really admired who away over the years. And so each of the red turtles is for one of those women. And the piece up here is called Archipelago. And I love the idea of islands that look physically separate, but are really connected under the water. And so I kept thinking about that as I was working on it.
So Leslie said, can you talk a little bit about your seed stitch techniques?
Yep. So seed stitch, really looks like a single stitch of running stitch. It's just a, little, however long you want to make it. What I find with seed stitch though is I stitch straight up through the fabric layers and then straight down again. So unlike running stitch, where you're doing this kind of waving process, the straight up and straight down gives me a lot more control. Actually, I can hold up.
Is that like a stab stitch?
Yes, exactly. So seed stitch and stab stitch are really the same thing. So this piece, I don't know how well you can see that, but this was a white oak leaf that I printed on wool. And then I did stab stitches all over, and then I added some little size 15 beads in the background. But I feel like that's a good example of about the density that I like to do, which is a lot. But I just love the look of it. I love the process. And I find that with that seed stitch or stab stitch, I get much better control over my stitch length than I do running stitch. So if I want a fair amount of to show and then a little space between stitches, then I'll always do seed stitch. If I want just sort of more texture, like the background of this piece, that's all running stitch. And the needle is going in and out of the fabric at a very shallow angle. So you get a different sort of surface. But I'll use both of those. And that's probably my go-to stitch for almost everything. And I keep thinking at some point I might get bored with this stitch, but I've been doing it for years and years and I still love it. And I love using variegated threads and blending different colors of embroidery floss strands. And like there's just sort of this endless opportunity for expression because you can choose different shapes. Like, with this, those little beads, I really wanted this feel of sort of a horizon line, but a breeze blowing back behind it, and just adding those few beads in that area, I felt like gave it a lot more texture. And then I don't know, I like the idea of wind currents and water currents and this feel of movement going on in a piece. So I find that really inspires a lot of the stitching designs that I do.
So what about needles? What can you tell us about using needles?
Sure. So with needles, first started quilting, I was just using like sharps, kind of shorter quilting needles. And then I got into beading and I made some friends with beaders and they all said, what do you do with those little short needles? And so I got some beading needles, which are quite a bit longer. And what I find is use the needle that's comfortable for you. So sharps or betweens, are very short quilting needles. Long beading needles are quite a bit longer. Milliner's needles are kind of an in-between length. Any of those work well. I typically, for my beading, will use a size 10 or 11 or 12 beading needle. The 12 is really small, and so that works well for really tiny beads. The 10s and 11s work for just about any other size bead, except for the really little ones. For hand quilting, I mostly use pearl cottons. So I'll use a size 7 embroidery needle. I'm working with, say, a size 12 pearl cotton or several strands of embroidery floss. And then I use size 24 chenille needle, which is also an embroidery needle, for things like a size 8 or 5 pearl cotton, which is a heavier. So if I have a good stash, and sometimes you can buy a set that ranges from, say, size 5 to 9 embroidery needles, that's really nice for thinner threads. And then if you get a few chenille needles in like a size 24 or maybe a 22, that's nice if you want to use bulkier thread. But obviously with bulkier thread, you got to make sure that the weave of your fabric is loose enough that you can get through the fabric without really beating up your hands, which I've learned the hard way. But also, like if you like to work on wool, I like doing a lot of my botanical printing and dyeing on wool flannel because I just love the way it takes the color and the prints. And in fact, this that I held up, this is on wool flannel. And you can get a fairly thick needle through that, just a bit more opaque than something like a commercial batik that has a very, very dense weave.
So Diane asked if you frame your pieces and do you use glass when you frame?
Okay, yeah, and that's a great question. And that, I guess it kind of depends on the piece and how I intend to use it. So for a lot of pieces that are smaller scale, like maybe a little bit bigger than these, what I've done is I've taken the finished piece and stitched it to linen covered mat board that I glue to an acid-free foam core. And then I'll actually draw, like a rectangular square that's the shape piece, but just a little bit smaller, and pierce holes through it. And then I stitch the piece to that panel of linen covered mat board, and then we'll frame it, and I either frame it just in a frame with no glass or in a shadow box. And then if I do a shadow box, I use museum glass on the front because I feel like I've put so much time into the piece that museum glass is just much better for visibility, and it also helps protect, in terms of UV and rays and fading. So I've done some pieces under glass. I've missions like for some hospitals, and they frame the stuff under plexiglass because fire code requires it. But I'll kind of plan what I'm doing knowing it's going to be under plexiglass, so the visibility might not be quite as good as if there were no glass. A lot of the pieces, the small pieces I'd hang up behind me, are actually framed in cigar boxes. So my dad used to smoke a lot of cigars, and he had these beautiful wood boxes he hung onto, and I think at one point I saw them and I said, oh, those are really nice. So he started giving me cigar boxes. But it reminded me of when I was a kid and I'd find, a shell or a feather or some little treasure, and I'd bring it home and I'd stick it in my little box of special things. And as I was looking at the cigar boxes, it just reminded me of the idea of taking things that were special to you and putting them in this little box. So I started using cigar boxes. I'd paint the edge around the piece and then create the little hand stitched panel to go inside of there. Bigger pieces I tend to not frame. The several bigger pieces I've done for hospitals, they've ended up mounting them and framing them themselves. But I feel like with the bigger pieces, I like letting them just be textiles and hanging. And so it kind of depends on where they're going to end up. If I were to sell it and somebody said, oh, I would really like this framed, then I can definitely mount it and frame it. And so I'm thinking like probably the biggest pieces I framed are maybe 15 inches square or like 12 by 18 inches. Most everything I've done bigger than that is not framed.
So do you, is there anything you haven't done yet that you're compelled to do in the future?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. I mentioned about wanting to do bigger pieces and to show some more work. And so I definitely want to do more of that. I'm starting to grow more of a dye garden myself. So I've got madder seeds and I've got some weld seeds. And I saw Jennifer, you got some indigo seeds. And um, I really love the idea of trying to focus more and more of my botanical printing and dyeing on what I can do just in my yard or just in my neighborhood, and having that connection to place, so that it is specific to Madison, Wisconsin. And so growing more of my own dye materials and my own plants for printing, and then really delving into, if I print leaves from coral bells over several, months of the year, what different things happen, and kind of trying to get much more intimately knowledgeable about plants that are growing in my area and what they can do. So I definitely want to do that. I definitely foresee continuing to teach, until I just, it's just too hard to pick up a suitcase because I love that. And, you know, I don't know, I don't draw well. And so I always feel like that's something that I ought to get more comfortable with. And I see people doing beautiful fiber work with different kinds of imagery on it. And so I'd like to nudge myself to experiment more, even if it's drawing into some of the fabrics that I have printed and dyed. Um, but mostly just keep going, because I feel like the more I do, the more ideas I get, which is kind of exciting because it's like one of those things that doesn't run out. You think, oh, do you ever, people ask, do you ever run out of ideas? And I think, no, if anything, I could live to about 150 and not use up the ideas that I have right now. So that's the big challenge, is just um, prioritizing which are the things that feel like the things I should really be working on right now, and which are the ideas that I can let sit for a few more years and see what happens. Um, and trying to get a little faster with my hand stitching because I do spend a lot of time slow hand stitching. So are there some approaches I can take to getting the stitches a little bit farther apart, and things like that. Um, yeah, but that's kind of where my thought process is right now in terms of
Do you
um,
have more than one piece going at a time?
oh yeah. I probably have too many pieces going at one time, but I do find, like I mentioned earlier, that I've got 3 pieces right now that are all at least 100 inches in one direction. And I did that very deliberately because I know kind of how I work throughout the year. So, it's cold here for a good 6, 7, 8 months of the year. And so I'm indoors, I'm in my studio, and it's a lovely space, but from at least May through September, it's just beautiful here. And we have the screen porch that we really enjoy. So I wanted to have a pretty good stash of hand stitching to work on so I could spend a lot more of my studio time on the porch. So I'm at least enjoying the warm weather. And, I may have a dozen pieces going at one time, which is probably more than I'd like to. But I do think having at least 3 or 4 is nice. And I have sort of different stations in my studio. So I've got, my sewing table where I put my sewing machine, which I really only use to piece fabrics together. But I find that I like being able to piece fairly. And then I've got a hand quilting station, so I can keep a great big there and keep working on it and not have to pack it all up and put it away. And so I find, having, and sometimes too, you just kind of need a break from something. Like if something's really tons of stitching, I can work on it for quite a while, but sometimes I just need a little bit of a mental break or a physical break if my hands are starting to get sore. So being able to hop up and then work on something on my design wall, and I'll frequently have, like when I'm not, giving a talk, this is covered with bits of fabric. I have a piece I'm working on at the preliminary design stages, but then I can leave that up for a while, for even several weeks or a month or more, and just sort of tweak things as I'm going along and working on other pieces. So I'm not necessarily forcing the design process to happen really fast, but I can back up just because of the way the house is configured. I'm in a room up above our garage. And then there's a bedroom connected to it, and I can get back into a hallway and stand probably 35 or 40 feet away and see at least part of the design wall. And I find that so helpful because then I can really see bigger scale pieces and look at the value structure and what's happening, and then come and, kind of rearrange things on the wall. So having some pieces I'm hand beading or hand quilting at the time, some pieces I'm designing, some pieces I'm piecing by machine. I like that mix.
How many hours do you think you stitch a day?
On a good day, 6 or 8. There are a lot of days where it's, contracts, I'm emailing, corresponding about upcoming workshops, or submitting stuff to shows. But I try to stitch at least a couple hours a day. So, there's a few days I don't stitch at all, but on a typical day, at least 2 hours, but up to 6 or 8 hours, just depending on what I'm working on. And I always admire people say, I get up at 5 and I do my, meditative sketching, and then I do this, and I love that idea. And it just is not something I have been able to bring myself to do. But I do find, now that both of our kids are out of the house, at least for now, it's been sort of back and forth, but that my husband's an artist and he teaches. And so we'll meet in the morning and we have coffee, and then we go our separate ways to our studios, and then we meet again for dinner. And that's been really nice. And it's sort of giving me this glimpse of life, at least for the foreseeable future, which is really lovely in terms of a lot of time available. And then, there's laundry and there's all that other stuff in between. But I'm feeling like I'm kind of on the cusp of a much more focused chunk of time in my life. My kids are 22 and 25, and so it's probably long past time to have been so focused lives, but I really just, spent a lot of time and mental energy trying to help them out as they were growing, and they've made it clear that they're functioning well on their own. And so it's just feeling excited to think about having this time that's going to be really, really focused on my artwork and my teaching in a way that I haven't been up to, the last year or so.
Do you have any tips to give other quilters or who want to kind of get into some stitching and beading? And
Yeah. I've got a couple of different tips, and one is sort of more related to if you want to make it a business for yourself, and then the other is just related to learning things. And so I'd say, if you're interested, because you're just like, I'm creative, I want to learn how to do these things, take some workshops, spend time looking at people's work online. That's the amazing thing, is that compared to when I first got started, Pinterest and Instagram, and there's all these fantastic tools out there to go explore different people's work. And early on, I started a thing called my inspiration book. And I just bought this 11-inch by 14-inch sketch pad. And then I would save pictures from different magazines of artwork I really liked. But I made categories within the inspiration book. So I had, I loved everything about it. And then there was composition, color, line, texture, technique, message. And then as I would look through this whole stack of pictures I had cut out of magazines over the years, I would try to analyze, what is it I'm responding to in this, and then put it in the appropriate category based on that. But it helped me to get to understand my own design sensibilities better, because then I'd go back and I'd sort of flip through this book and I think, okay, clearly there's an approach to design and composition that I'm really drawn to, and I'm seeing some connections here. So that helped me to start to think more about design and how I wanted to approach design. And then getting a few books of people's work you really love, and taking some workshops. Now I probably take one workshop a year, but early on I would take, a few, and just try to learn from people who've been doing this for a long time, because there are things I've said, like there was a line in James Sassaman's book, I think it's called The Quilted Garden. And she was talking about taking each component of her quilt as far as she could before she attached it to the rest of the piece. Well, that had never occurred to me. So she's doing mostly machine stitching and a little bit of hand stitching. But like this piece, the archipelago piece, I beaded that entire little panel before I attached it to the rest of the quilt. And that was very much inspired by what she had. So tapping into people who've been at what you want to do for a long time is really helpful, and even taking workshops from different people who teach similar things. if you're really interested in like botanical printing and dyeing, I've taken classes with several different people, and you just get their perspective and their approach, and it can be different. And now I feel like there's a hybrid of these different things I've learned from other people as well as things I've learned on my own. So I guess that would be kind of my advice for people getting started. Be gentle on yourself. I mean, I always have people say, "Oh, I'm the slowest one in the class." I'll say, anytime I take a class, I'm the slowest one in the class. I take a long time to make decisions. Don't beat yourself up. There's no prize for being the fastest one, because what you're doing is you're trying to tap into your own creativity and the joy that you get from that. I think if you're thinking about, I'm creative, I've always done all this, sewing or fiber work, and I'd like to make a business out of it. I think thinking about the different sets of activities that go into making a business. So whether it's, you're making wearable pieces, you're doing the art fair circuit, you're trying to do commission work, am I good at planning things out and conveying them to a client, and then my studio pretty much way more than full time for 3 months. If that feels like a good fit to you, then maybe pursuing commission work is a way to go. But if you feel like, wow, I can produce really fast and these are pieces that are exciting to people, but I could price them in a way that would be affordable, then thinking about shows that are and you're showing things that way. So kind of looking at your personality and your skill set, and what are the things, because being a fiber artist it's a wonderful studio time, but all the other stuff, whether it's contracts or submitting stuff to shows, and what other set of activities feel like a good fit for your skills and your personality, and that helps to give you a direction. But I see if you can out just because you love to create, that's a really nice place to be. And then if down the road you feel like, okay, I want to try to create a business out of this, then you have a bit more knowledge and experience to bring to it.
Yeah, and for anybody who's never taken a class with Lisa before, she comes as a super, super organized instructor who brings these very well-made class kits with everything you need in it. So I know you put a lot of time in getting ready for your class with your little instruction books that you make up and your class kits, and her classes are just delightful. She was we were talking earlier, she came in January to the studio. She was my first in-person teacher this year who braved it from Wisconsin to Florida. And so everybody did botanical prints and did some stitching. And all of a sudden in the last couple of weeks, these pieces have started to show up on Facebook where the students are finally getting them completed and ready to the point that they're ready to show them. So, it's March, so it's taken about 3 months for everybody and to get these pieces finished. And I think that when they came in, you kind of think you're going to create all this stuff, and then you get 1 or 2 pieces done, and it's all that.
It's funny because I've had people come into a class, like when I was doing these bead embroidery ornaments, and somebody say, "So we're not going to finish it today?" I'm like, "No, no." But hopefully you'll finish it at home, have the instructions to finish it at home. But yeah, it's exciting. People have started something in class and they're just jazzed about it, and they're so much great work in that workshop, and it's been wonderful to see what people have been finishing up. And as you're talking about the booklets that I create, when I was working doing public policy work for the state of Wisconsin, I did lots and lots of writing, and a lot of the writing that I did was, it was like totally different from fiber art. Be analyzing, if you want to set up a regional transit authority, what are the different ways you could approach it? But I realized I spent years and years writing documents about different ways to approach taking on a task or solving a problem. And I feel like I'm still doing the same thing with fiber art, that I create these booklets, and here are the different ways you can approach, beading something, or the different ways you can approach botanical printing and dyeing and then making a piece from it. And so it's been kind of fun to realize that there was this skill set that I had in a different field that I have brought to this. And I love making those little booklets for people. It's because I feel like I like giving some historical context to what we're doing. And then, here are all the materials that we're using. So if this is something you fall in love with and you're going to want to do it some at home, here's what I can tell you about what you need to do it at home. And then kind of here's what we're doing throughout our 3 days or 5 days together. And that's been fun to do that.
Well, does anybody out there have any questions for Lisa? Oh, Sharon wants to know if you've considered publishing a book.
And I'm smiling because I've had, early on I was teaching people like, you should think about a book. And then at some point I had students saying, when are you going to do a book? And so I have thought about it off and on for a long time. I've written a bunch of articles for Quilting Arts and for, I'm trying to even think, Art Quilting Studio. I just had a couple articles in there in the last couple of issues. And I do enjoy writing quite a bit. So it's just kind of in the burner of, if I did a book, it would probably be embroidery, because I still have a broader set of expertise in that area than I do in some of the other things I do. So yeah, so it's a definite maybe, but I haven't really dove into it yet.
Yeah, anybody else with any questions?
Let's take a peek at.
So where are you headed off to? Where are some of your upcoming events you have planned?
I've got an online class I'm teaching now, and another one that's a group in April. In June, I'm going to be out in Vermont. There's a I hope I'm saying it right, Fiber Art Center or Fiber Art School that's in, I believe, Williston, Vermont. And I'm doing 5 days of classes, a 2-day and a 3-day. So I'll be doing a class called Dots and Dashes, the language of the handmade stitch. That's bead embroidery and hand stitch. And then a 3-day version of In the Boro Spirit. Then so that's late June, mid-July, I'm up on Madeline Island at the Madeline Island School of the Arts, doing a 5-day botanical printing and dyeing, which should be a really nice time of year for that. Then in August, I'm out at the Hudson River Valley Art School Art Workshop, doing botanical printing and dyeing with them, up through about the 21st of August. September, I'm out on Whidbey Island at the Pacific Northwest School of the Arts, doing In the Boro Spirit. And then I'm blanking a little bit on October, but I know I've got some stuff in November in Wisconsin. January, I'm back with Suzanne for, I think it'll be my 5th January in a row of coming down to Aya Fiber Studios, which I just love. And we'll be doing the In the Boro Spirit, I believe, on a 4-day workshop.
And
And
January is always nice.
oh, it is. It's such a treat. And it was fun. This year, I kind of expected it to be mostly locals because of the pandemic. And I think half the class was Maine and North Dakota and Wisconsin and, and then people from Florida as well. But what a treat. We get to be at your lovely studio and down by the water. And so, yeah, and then 2022 is starting to kind of fill out, scale a bunch of different places. Lately in Wisconsin, I'm mostly just teaching at, there's a lovely gallery called Arts. It's up in Sauk Prairie, which is about 40 minutes northwest of Madison, the Wisconsin River, and I did a botanical printing and dyeing class there. So I'll have 2 different workshops in 2022 there. So yeah, I'm kind of hopping around the country, a bunch of different places, but I'm excited about that. And my sense is that people are pretty excited to get back into in-person classes, and saw that, when we were teaching.
Suzanne?
Yes.
For some reason, my chat doesn't work. So I tried and I couldn't work it. Lisa, could you give us your website?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep. So my website's just lisabinkley.com.
Okay, that's easy.
The page that comes up is all of my upcoming teaching. It's not as up to date as it ought to be on my artwork. And so Instagram and Facebook, I've got Lisa Binkley Fiber Art. And I'd say probably those 2 places are the best places to go for the most up-to-date in of my work.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Yeah.
I lost my chain of thought for a second there.
That's okay.
I think that's happening lately. Have you had your vaccines?
I had my first shot. Yep. So I've got my second one scheduled April 14th, and my husband's getting his as well. And Wisconsin seems to be doing pretty well. My daughter, we saw her last night, and she said she's been notified that she's eligible. And so it's just a matter of waiting until they're available. But it's just feeling exciting about, getting back out into the world again. And
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I had my second this last week.
Oh, good. Wonderful.
And I was just, other than a little sore arm, I didn't have any effects. So
Great. Yeah, I just had a little
Positive.
bit of a sore arm after the first, but that was all. But it's exciting to.
yeah, I think everybody, I've noticed a lot more people on the, contacting me lately, showing interest on the classes,
Yeah.
but like I said, I've got to get some new info out there. Sandy,
Sure.
did you have a question?
Yeah, Lisa, when are you going to be on Whigby Island?
September, somewhere around like the 21st-ish, but it's, if you go to lisabinkley.com, the page that comes up is the upcoming workshop. So I'll be there for 4 days in late
Okay.
September.
You're at the Pacific Northwest Art Center?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm in California, so that's
Okay.
perfect for me.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I'm excited. That'll be my first time teaching there. And that was one of those classes that was supposed to happen last summer, and then it got pushed back. But fortunately, they had a space, in September, and said, let's just try this now. And I've been teaching online a bunch through the Mendocino Art Center.
Oh, yes.
That was somewhere I was supposed to have been in person last summer. And then, that. So, but then we started doing some online workshops. And so I'm in a 2-week online workshop for them right now. And so that's been a nice fit too.
Great. Thank you.
That, you know what, I realized I have a couple I just created like a little 6-image PowerPoint of just some of my work. Would you want me to show that?
Sure, go ahead. That would
Okay.
be great.
Do a screen share. And so this is just a really quick representative sample of my work. So this is an older piece. It's about 15 inches square, but when I was first really getting into beading, and then here's 2 different quilts. The one on the right is actually the one behind me over my shoulder, and then the one on the left is another indigo dyed and rust dyed, and then the pale yellow is actually dandelion dye that I make. And then here are a few more of the cigar box pieces, and then another small quilt. This is about 6 by 14 inches on the left. And I just showed a close-up detail of the hand stitching so you could get a better for that.
That's gorgeous.
And then this piece is called Winter Work. So this was actually a blanket from some botanical printing that was kind of that orangey color you get from dipping things in iron. And then I dyed it with hibiscus flowers that my next door neighbor used to save for me from her garden. I get this really beautiful sort of taupey color, and then lots of hand embellishment on there. And the last 2 pictures are just a couple of more recent pieces of taking my botanically printed and dyed wool flannel and then machine piecing them and hand stitching them. So this one's probably about 40 something, 42 inches wide, and about 23 inches high. And then the one on the left is about 48 inches wide. And then the little piece on the right is the one I was holding up and showing, but just to get a more. So my typical process is to dye and print the fabrics and then machine piece them together and dive into lots of hand stitching. But I find that that's really a process that I love so much that I know I'll keep doing that, on into the future. So anyway, so yeah, a quick sample.
You've given the blanket that we're told never to fall in love with and never to keep.
Oh,
right?
I was never told to not fall in love with them. I'm so glad I wasn't, because I do fall in love with them. And in fact, I've had people like the bundle and then throw them in the mordant bucket because they're like, this is so much better than the real piece. But yeah, there's a big piece I'm working on right now that's 70 by 100 inches, but it's all piece. But I'd say probably a good quarter, I don't know, maybe half of it is blankets rather than the original. But Yeah, you just get some really great stuff with blankets.
Yeah, I find some of my blankets are better than the pieces.
Yeah, and I tell students that too. I was like, don't be surprised if when you open it, you look at the blanket and you're like, this is better than, and I don't know what it is about that, but I find I just used unbleached muslin blankets, or I'll use flannel, but if I use the flannel, I just keep reusing those. I don't save those, but so mostly I'll scour my blanket material ahead of time, so that at least it's going to take whatever pigment it's going to take pretty well. But yeah, I hang on to both the
Mhm.
blanket and the originals quite a bit.
So what did you say you're using mostly for your blankets? And you said the muslin.
Muslin if I'm doing cotton or linen, and then I'll use flannel if I'm going to be working on wool, because the flannel heavier, but it feels like a good combination. The flannel, then I wash in hot water and I reuse those over and over again. And once in a while I'll reuse the muslin too, but I frequently find I like the muslin enough that I want to just hang on to it. And and I was kind of glad I had hung on to so many of those, because the big quilt I was just talking about, I had just been saving a bunch of botanically printed and dyed fabrics that were cottons for a long time, and thinking I'm just sort of waiting for the perfect idea, which is probably not something I'd recommend. But I then, when I saw quilts that a woman named Cindy Grisdella, and I actually took a class with her, and she's doing a lot of piecework and sort of modified log cabin type blocks. I just felt like my head sort of exploded in a really good way of, this is what I can do with those fabrics, and started cutting and piecing, and that's turned into this 70 by 100-inch quilt top. So I was glad I hung on to them, but it does remind me, I heard a great saying the other day, which is, don't die with your best fabrics on your shelf. And I think it was Pat Pauley who said that, and somebody shared that with me. And I have found, after I passed 50, I thought, the someday stuff really start being used. And so I feel like I'm much more comfortable now just grabbing the stuff I think is really wonderful and gorgeous and saying, okay, this is going to go into this quilt. It's not going to get saved for a someday project, because sometimes you change directions, and then the thing you thought was so fabulous never gets used at all. And another co-teacher at QSDS, Kevin Womack, collecting all these botanical printed and dyed fabrics, and he said, use them up, you'll make more. And I thought, yeah, you're absolutely right. I tend to try to give that advice to students now too, is if you love it, go ahead and use it.
What about fading?
So fading's definitely an issue. I have found that within botanicals, for my own stuff that I, showing and selling, I don't use all of the dyes. There are some that I kind of focus on that I feel like are a bit more color fast than others. But, anytime I sell work, I do say, don't hang it in direct light. Don't hang it with fluorescent lights shining on it all the time. Understand that, like paper art, fabric art will, if it gets hit with a lot of light. And medium glass is one way of protecting the surface, but some beads fade too. So yeah, just kind of, I think, trying to make the owners aware of that and how to take good care of it is a good way to go. And then I'll have things up on my design wall, but when I'm not working on them, I'll have them rolled and put away so they're protected from light, just to try to give them as long a life as they can have.
Okay.
But yeah, it's definitely a big issue.
Yeah, fading is always an issue with anything to do with fiber,
Right. Yeah, and I think it's probably tougher where you are, because you get so much stronger sunlight than we do. But you're going to hang something on your wall, if you've got kind of an interior space that's not going to get hit with direct sunlight, that's a really good way to go. If it's a smaller piece and you get under UV protective glass or museum glass, or even there's UV protective plexiglass, really makes a difference. I also find that the hand dyed fabrics, I think, hold pigment better than commercial dyed fabrics to some extent. Knowing that they've been scoured and mordanted properly, you're going to give them the best chance of having a long life and looking really good.
Yeah, I mean, I have some pieces that were dyed with logwood and they just look absolutely terrible now. The whole
I don't-
color has changed. And
yeah,
it's just-
Yep. Yeah, logwood's one of those that I feel like, cochineal and madder, weld some of the yellows, walnut, those kinds of things, indigo, I feel pretty good about the durability of those colors. Logwood is I think one of the least durable of the durable botanical pigments. So I find I don't use a lot of that.
Well, I noticed, like, just looking at your background, you have a lot of turquoises and
Yeah.
your color, you can definitely see your color palette.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. Rusty oranges and turquoise. And yeah.
Yeah. So before we head off, I wanted to take one more call to see if anybody had any questions for Lisa.
Yeah, this is Sharon. It's actually a comment more than a question. I don't know if you saw that, but I heard you talking about growing up in Chicago and that connection to the water. I
Yes.
too grew up in Chicago. I'm now in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the water thing is a real draw for me. There's a wonderful passage in Toni Morrison's book, Song of Solomon, where she talks about people who grow up in the Great Lakes region and, having this draw to be near bodies of water. So I don't know if you know that book, but that might be something to look at.
Yeah, which is Toni Morrison and which one was it?
Song of Solomon.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna write that down because I really, I listen to a lot of audiobooks while I'm working in my studio, and because I love reading, but I find that I get kind of twitchy just trying to sit and read and not stitch. So I've got a great library system here and listen to a lot of books. So I'll look for that one on audio. And I do find that, even though we were probably 10 miles west of the lake, I grew up in Oak Park, but we would go down quite a bit downtown. But now in Madison, a half a block off of Lake Mendota, which is the biggest lake in Madison. And so when I walk my dog, we walk by the lakefront every day. And there's just something about the colors of the water and the way it changes throughout the seasons. And I think that combined with the trees and the foliage that we have in the area, I feel like that's been my inspiration probably since I was a little kid. And I think probably will continue to be my inspiration for the rest of my life.
Yeah. I retired just before the pandemic started, but before that, I was commuting by ferry every day to my job in San Francisco. So I got to see the water and, the ships coming in and the birds flying and just all of, the natural life and the human activity on the water, and took lots and lots and lots of pictures with my phone at all hours, dawn and dusk. And
yeah, sounds wonderful. What a nice headspace to be in too as you're commuting.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, if nobody else has any questions, we'll let Lisa get on with her day. She's probably going to be stitching today. And everybody else, I see lots of people in my little pictures. They're all stitching away up there too.
Good.
But I appreciate you talking with us this morning. And
thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again, and everybody, post your pictures of the stuff that you're working on. I even saw Mary up there still working on her piece.
Good.
She's got going. She's got it working
There.
on it. There it is. Oh,
I can see your piece. Hang on. Oh my gosh, it's so spectacular, Mary. Wow.
It's
you turn it around?
coming.
it's coming.
I've had so many people comment on the pictures from that workshop where you had that laid out on your table. Like, oh my gosh, it's just spectacular.
Yeah. Would you be able to show that?
Wow.
Could you screen share it so we could see it?
Yeah, let me.
If you can.
I'll spotlight Mary.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Spotlight Mary. Perfect.
There she is.
Here, I'll step back a little.
Oh,
Gorgeous.
so beautiful. That palette's great. That's changed a lot since. But I love what you've done with cutting out some of the different individual motifs, and
Yeah.
fantastic. And you have this beautiful lining too. Did you just like a madder dyed really drapey wool or a wool silk blend inside.
Yes, yes. It's a
Oh.
wool silk blend inside.
Lovely.
And then there's a rayon lining, which gives it a ton of drape too, which I really like.
Yeah. Oh, it's
And
just
it's
gorgeous.
lovely to stitch through.
I bet it is. I bet it's really an enjoyable process to be
Yeah.
stitching it as you're going.
Now that I'm done with all the tedious part of putting it together and
Well, I remember in class when you're working all the basting and you're like, I know it's going to get more fun. It's a lot of basting right now.
it is. It's been great. And that class was just so fun.
Oh, we had a great time. It was really nice. Yeah, I love seeing that.
Thank you.
Well-
It's beautiful.
Next week is Easter, so we won't have a coffee with the artists next week. The following week, I think we come back with Teresa Brown.
Okay.
Sign up on Eventbrite if you're interested in taking it. And
Can you describe Teresa Brown's take on art?
Teresa is an echo printer, but she does echo printing on paper and linen. She actually has a background. She's also a silk painter, and she was a portrait painter. And she's out of the Raleigh, North Carolina area. But with that, I'll let everybody go. And thank you very much, Lisa, for a wonderful talk.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
you.
Suzanne. I really enjoyed being here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Okay, well, have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah.
Very enjoyable.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.